I want to thanks everybody for coming. This is Logan's defense presentation, and I'll let him um, talk about his title and all that. I'm mostly excited for you guys to hear Logan do an impression of a blue grouse. Here, he's been practicing. um, and with that, we'll just turn it over to you and get going.
All right. Thank you, Dave. All right, see if this is working. All right. Thanks for coming, guys. My name is Logan Clark. I'll be presenting on my master's project for my pursuit in a wildlife biology degree. And my talk covers the ecology and management of these two forest grouse. I'll be covering these three broader concepts, including some breeding, passive acoustic monitoring, some spatial behavior stuff, and then a harvest analysis. I'm going to get right into it, trying to keep this under an hour. So the way this is going to go is I'll first give you some background on the importance of game species monitoring, and which will set up my first research chapter, which is looking at these passive acoustic technique potentials to monitor these birds. Then I'll jump into some dusky grouse life history, setting up the next two sections, which are these spatial analyses on their seasonal ranges and their site fidelity trends, and then a winter habitat selection analysis, and then I'll wrap it up with a harvest dynamics analysis. All right, so it's pretty important that we monitor game species in particular. Now, these are animals that we harvest out of the wild. We have to set bag limits and season dates, and much of this is done through what we call post-harvest monitoring methods. So you can think of things like duck banding or these fishery creel surveys, wing collection stations, and then the really big one being these surveys that are sent out to hunters at the end of the season, asking for information on harvest and effort. Now, it's important that we have a meaningful effort to monitor these species outside of that harvest season, which is usually just in the fall, so we can get at things like winter mortality. You can think of aerial flights for big game in the winter, or maybe spawning or targeted netting surveys for different fish year-round, camera trap surveys to monitor populations throughout the year, and then waterfowl have these big flights over the reproductive habitat to kind of assess how they're doing at that time of year. Now I'm just going to pivot to grouse and game birds for the rest of this talk here. And there are many grouse species that do have these robust spring monitoring programs. Much of those are the lekking grouse, so you can think of sage grouse, sharptail, or other prairie grouse species that gather at these discrete, predictable sites spring after spring to do their mating displays. And these sites are often in more convenient locations, and biologists and managers can visit these locations year after year and count the lek attendance to get an idea of how these populations are doing year after year. Now, many of these lekking grouse are on the western side of the continent, where these state agencies are doing these lek counts. But we also have these 4 forest grouse species in the western U.S., being the spruce, ruffed, dusky, and sooty grouse. Now, they do not lek. They do these breeding displays in the spring, so they offer this opportunity for us to go out there and survey for them. But you'd have to cover some serious ground to do any sort of meaningful survey for these species. And I'm going to further hone in on the 2 overlapping forest grouse that we have here in Utah, those being the dusky and the ruffed grouse. And we know from some of those hunter surveys that they are pretty popular endeavors for hunters, particularly at the beginning of the season. Here in Utah, the forest grouse season kind of kicks off the hunting season. So we know that they're popular, and we really don't have any robust breeding monitoring programs for these birds here in Utah, or really forest grouse across the West, with a few exceptions. And that's probably because these birds live in places like this in the spring when they're doing their displays. This is Tony Grove Lake, in early May from 2 years ago. And even though we have all the snow on the ground, these birds are still out doing their displays. To get at these birds and cover some serious ground, you'd have to employ these over-the-snow vehicles or snowshoes and skis. You know, forest gates and roads are closed. Half the mountain's covered in mud. The other half is covered in snow. So there's these real logistical challenges to getting out there and covering ground to survey for these birds in the spring. All right, that kind of sets up my first research question to see how we can maybe get around some of these logistical challenges using passive acoustic techniques. And before I get into that, I want to show you a little more background on these two birds. So this is the male dusky grouse doing his hooting display. There's no audio in this video. You won't be able to hear it anyway because it's this very low frequency noise. Fortunately, he makes a few other noises, one of which called the single note woot. It's kind of like a hum note, this loud, broadcasty type of note that folks can hear from a considerable distance. Now, the other bird, the ruffed grouse, does this non-vocal wing-beating drumming display where he gets up usually on a log and does this accelerating drumming sequence, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So that's another kind of broadcasty type of display noise that we can use to survey these birds. Here are what those look like on what's called a spectrogram. So this is a graphical or visual representation of sound with time on the x-axis and frequency or pitch on the y-axis here. And there's that single note woot of the dusky grouse over there. And then below, we have this accelerating drumming sequence of the ruffed grouse. I'd also like to add that the ruffed grouse have this tendency to perform this drumming sequence almost every 4 minutes. So next time you hear one of these, stick around for 4 minutes and see if he does it again. All right, now I'm going to introduce these fancy microphones. We call them autonomous recording units, or ARUs. You might hear me say ARU or microphone going forward. These are pretty popular tools used by researchers and biologists. Nowadays, they were really pioneered by bat researchers almost like 2 decades ago now. We have a hard time hearing and detecting bats, and we'd have to use these machines to do so. But lately, they've become very popular for all sorts of tasks. So songbirds and insects and amphibians and whales is another big one. And they offer this more convenient opportunity to kind of set it and forget it, where you can put these devices up on the landscape at perhaps a time where it's more convenient for you to be up there in these logistically challenging landscapes. And you can program them to sleep and then turn back on maybe in April and start recording this audio data. So my first real question here is trying to compare a more traditional human-based survey for these forest grouse to a more passive acoustic microphone approach. And you can imagine there's probably some major trade-offs to what a human and a microphone are able to do. One of the biggest ones being that a microphone has a hard time counting anything, right? I can stand at a site and be, I hear a grouse over there, I hear another one behind me, a third one off to the right. Even though I'm probably not seeing these birds, I have this directionality to my hearing. I'm easily able to tease out individuals, whereas the microphone is just hearing these detections, right? And it might not be able to tease out how many individuals are contributing to these detections, or rather this presence-absence data set. And this presence-absence data set has been pretty useful in microphones in the past to do what we call occupancy surveys, just asking, is this animal at this site, yes or no, or biodiversity surveys, how many different kinds of animals is at this site. But getting at abundance, how many of that certain kind of animal, how many individuals are at this site, has historically been pretty tricky to do with a machine that cannot count. Otherwise, there are some major advantages that the microphones have, that being that they collect a lot more data. You know, a human observer type of survey, we don't have unlimited personnel, right? So the human might get to that site and they have a couple minutes to count or survey, and then they got to move on to the next site. Whereas this microphone can sit there, you know, all day, every day, and record if that's what you want it to do. And so we have this vast temporal coverage provided by the microphones. There's many other trade-offs that I don't have time to get into, but you get the idea. Now, to do this comparison, I did both, right? So we have these over 100 sites up in Logan Canyon, right here above the university. They were split into these transects with about 4 to 6 stops, sites along each transect, and we put up over 100 microphones at each of these sites, or one each rather, and we programmed them to turn on at 5 a.m. and go through 11 a.m. when these birds are most active. And we started putting these up in early March, and that's going to be before the display season. And then we let them record and took them down at a much more convenient time around the late summer. Now, during that time, we returned to these sites and did a more traditional human survey for these 2 forest grouse species. And those surveys consisted of these 16-minute observation periods where we'd get to the site, the microphone's already at the site, it's been recording, and we're counting the number of ruffed and dusky grouse that we detect, almost all of which is by ear. We did have a few visual detections, so that's another thing the microphone can't see, right? And during the final 4 minutes of these surveys, we played an electric playback speaker of kind of the sexy dusky grouse female noise to try and elicit a response from those male dusky grouse only. And then we actually visited each site 3 times to do these human-based counts over a week apart each. So when we took all the microphones down, most of them did exactly what I wanted them to. Over 85% of them filled up their memory cards, which is about 70 days of recording. I only lost 1. And then I was left with 22,000 hours, over 900 days of audio data, which almost filled up a 5 terabyte external hard drive. So obviously I didn't listen to all of this audio recording, but had to use a computer program to tease out these detections. And this was by far the hardest part of this whole project. You can ask me more about it later. I don't have time to get into all of it, but what I ended up using was a pretty recently developed signal processing tool on the ruffed grouse drumming display. It's just looking for that accelerating pattern, and it has a dozen parameters that you can fine-tune on your own data to try and get it to perform better. And I achieved about a 75 to 80% accuracy rate on that classifier. Now, the dusky grouse one was a little more involved, listening for that woot noise. That I had to use what's called a convolutional neural network, which is really just a machine learning model where you feed it examples of the target noise. And so I fed it hundreds and hundreds of examples of the dusky grouse woot noise. And then over this very iterative process, it kind of trains and validates itself. And this took a couple weeks. And this was all in a Python coding environment. There was no fancy graphical user interface to do this, unfortunately. But when it was all done, that one achieved about an 80 to 85% accuracy rate on the dusky grouse. And then I used these 2 model classifiers to predict upon the rest of my 900 days of audio data. And then was ultimately left with about a 10 gigabyte .csv file that was like 45 million rows long of a detection record for these 2 birds. Some quick comparisons here. This table down there, we can see sites that the microphone only detected these 2 birds. And so we had 28 sites where the microphone only detected dusky grouse and the humans did not. And then over 50 sites where the microphones detected ruffed grouse and humans did not. And the inverse was only true of 1 site where the microphone failed to detect a dusky grouse and the humans did. We can also get these phonology trends with the microphone data. As we can see here, there's a little bit of a mismatch of when these birds kind of peak and start their displays. And we can use this large data set to maybe hone in on ideal times to be surveying for them. All right, now I want to walk you through how we can use microphones to count things or at least estimate abundance, the number of individuals. First, I'm just going to walk you through how we do this with the human-based surveys. And so this first model is called the N-mixture model. It's taking the raw counts from those 3 visits at each site, and it's using the discrepancy in those counts to get at a detection probability for these 2 birds. And then it combines that with the raw counts to then estimate this latent abundance variable at that site. That one's pretty straightforward. Now, I'm going to go into the first microphone model, which is called the Royal Nichols model. And those visits were, each morning was a visit. And so we had 70 mornings, 70 visits. And what that one's doing, it's just a simple yes or no. Did you hear a grouse today? Yes or no. Move to the next morning. Did you hear one? Yes or no. And you can imagine that the true number of grouse at that site is ultimately going to govern the amount of yeses or nos that you get. More grouse, more yeses. You get the idea. And I know it almost seems like magic, but you're actually able to kind of back estimate an abundance just using this yes or no data type. The next one is called a time to detection model. And what that one's doing is asking how much time in a morning did it take to hear your first ruffed or dusky grouse? And again, I asked that for 70 mornings. And you can imagine the more grouse at a site, the less time it's going to take that morning. Less grouse or no grouse, you might go all morning without hearing it, and then it rolls over to the next day. Lastly, for ruffed grouse only, I used another count-based and mixture model, trying to leverage the fact that they do this 4-minute frequency to their drumming displays. And so I took a random 4-minute interval from each morning, from each microphone, and treated the number of detections as a count of ruffed grouse at that site. So if you hear 2 drums in 4 minutes, well, that's a pretty good idea that there are 2 ruffed grouse at that site. So I'm going to jump into the results here. I'm going to set it up a little bit. I chose to summarize my results on the transect level. I didn't want to throw up 100 different comparisons for you. And then what it's going to show is the average site at that transect, like the abundance estimate for an average site at that transect. And a site is loosely defined as a 20-hectare circle around where we stood and where the microphones were. Okay, so we have a lot going on here. I'm going to walk you through it. This top panel, we have the dusky grouse comparisons. So those blue estimates are the human-based abundance estimates. We can see that they're often higher than the red and green, the 2 microphone ones. And they have these much wider 95% confidence intervals, these vertical blue bars. Whereas the Royal Nichols and the time to detection, the red and green, are a little more confident, well, a lot more confident in their estimates. And they're also in close agreement. You can see that red and green is almost overlapping across the board, despite having 2 pretty different response variables. But we do get this proportionality as we move from one transect to the next. Almost all estimates kind of move up and down with each other, and that was nice to see. Now we'll move down to the ruffed grouse. We have a little bit more going on here. So these gold points are the human-based abundance estimates. Again, we see these wider confidence intervals. We have less certainty in that estimate. And then again, the red and green, the Royal Nichols and time to detection are in pretty close agreement with each other. And then finally, we have this purple one, which is that 4-minute trick model, which seems to be the most conservative. Across the board, it's spitting out the lowest abundance estimates. And again, we have that proportionality. And we also have a closer agreement between the human and the microphone estimates, where it really depended which transect you were at, if it was going to be a human or a microphone-based estimate was higher or lower. So a little better with the ruffed grouse. So what may have been going on here? Why were these blue points so much higher than the microphone ones? So what I think might be going on is the dusky grouse is violating this fixed population assumption to some degree. So all of these models assume what's called a fixed population or closed population, meaning that during that survey period, nobody is coming and going between sites. And I think that's probably true for the older age classes of the dusky grouse. He's a longer-lived bird than the ruffed grouse and has these more defined age classes. And I think these younger males, particularly those born last year, are filtering through the landscape a little bit more, leading to these discrepancies with our 3-visit counts, whereas the microphones were recording for 70 days, and we're able to generalize that violation away a little bit better. We were also using the e-call for the dusky grouse only, and the e-call worked very well. We'd often play it, and then we'd have more male dusky grouse respond than we originally thought were there. But there were some days that it did not work at all, and we all seemed to notice that. That could have something to do with like the weather that day or the social context of what was going on in the grouse world at that site at that morning. I don't know. But I believe that also introduced some variation to our 3-visit counts with the humans, and the microphones didn't have to deal with the e-call. Overall, I think the vast data we get from these microphones, combined with the Royal Nichols and the time to detection models, produce what I would consider pretty ecologically plausible estimates. So again, we will never truly know how many birds are at these sites. That is an unknowable number. But having spent, now nearing 3 springs up at these places, counting these birds, it is my opinion that those estimates spit out by the microphones were probably closer to that true value, and particularly that 4-minute trick with the ruffed grouse. That was the most conservative usually, and I think that worked best. And that could be important for some of these conservation initiatives we have going on for ruffed grouse on the southeastern part of the range, where we have a lot of like habitat treatments and a lot of surveys going on for these birds. They're not doing so well there, so this could be a promising tool for them, particularly where we have this conservation need. Overall, I think the microphones did a pretty good job and provide a promising alternative to getting around these logistical issues of getting up on the mountain. And you can get a lot more out of the microphone than just these 2 birds, right? I listened to a few hours of these data as I was just working through it, and I heard all kinds of things like howling coyotes and belting mule deer fawns, owl species, other bird species that I never detected up there myself. And so you can squeeze a lot out of these microphone data sets that are also a permanent record that you can revisit whenever you want, and we can use those data to ask questions about a multitude of different species if we want to go back and revisit it. All right, I'm going to move on to the next section here and give you a little bit of background about the dusky grouse specifically. So the dusky grouse, again, is this older, longer-lived bird, larger as well than the ruffed grouse, and he kind of has this weird classification history where they used to be called blue grouse up until 2006, where this very targeted DNA study found compelling evidence to split the blue grouse into 2 species, the sooty grouse of the Pacific coastal ranges and the dusky grouse of the Rocky Mountains and the Intermountain West. Otherwise, they're a very similar bird. We see a few minor plumage differences here. They have pretty similar life history traits as well. Now, both blue grouse species are very closely related to some of these other longer-lived grouse, like sage grouse and the prairie grouse species, which has some implications for their management due to that slower reproduction cycle and longer-lived trait. I think the biggest discrepancy between dusky and sooty grouse would be the research intensity that both have received. So here's a graph of publications over time. We have all blue grouse publications on that top black line, and then what we now know to be just dusky grouse based publications in that lighter lower line. And we see much of it is in the 60s and the 80s, and that's because we had these 2 gentlemen that really dedicated their lives to studying the blue grouse, and they did most of their studies in the Pacific Northwest, which is on the now sooty grouse. So that space in between the 2 lines would be all sooty grouse publications, and we see much fewer dusky grouse research intensity, particularly after the split. Neither species has received much. So there's this catching up to do with what we think we know about that dusky grouse in particular. One of the cooler traits that these dusky grouse have is they are known as reverse elevational migrants, which is this pretty rare life history trait in the animal kingdom, where they tend to go upslope towards the top of the mountains for the wintertime, where they persist in these conifer stands near the subalpine on a diet of almost 100% conifer needles. And then come spring, they start to move downslope generally to these more diverse and patchy type of habitats where they do their mating and breeding and rearing their young. Then come fall, they're thinking of going back up. So knowing that, we'll jump into my first kind of spatial life history questions I had regarding their seasonal ranges and their site fidelity tendencies. You might not be familiar with the term site fidelity, but I promise you are all familiar with the concept, that being just certain animals having this tendency to return to these same spaces time and time again. You can think of salmon running up the rivers, a bear selecting the same denning site year after year. But then these longer-lived grouse species are also well documented to be pretty site faithful, including the sage and the prairie grouse, and also the sooty grouse, this close cousin of the dusky grouse, had this long color banding study back in the 60s where they marked over 100 birds and found that almost all of them were returning to these same display sites. These males were returning to their same hooting display sites, including a few that persisted at these sites for 6 years, even as the forest had grown up around them. And I included that quote to kind of drive home this point that they have this long tendency to return to these same spaces time and time again, even if that space is changing for the better or worse. And you can imagine that that might have some implications. So to get at this question, I used a dusky grouse GPS data set from a previous grad student who studied them in East Central Nevada, and then another grad student a few years back who was GPS marking dusky grouse here in the Bear River Range. And then I myself went out and captured grouse these past 2 years, mostly aided by pointing dogs, and we use these noosing poles to capture the birds, and then also these more passive methods of this walk-in funnel traps that we would check daily. And then we were putting these little GPS devices that kind of sat on their rump, on their lower back, and they had these elastics and padding to sit comfortably on the bird, and a solar panel to allow us to collect as much data as we could. So I first wanted to dig into their seasonal range tendencies, and to start off doing that, I had to estimate these seasonal ranges, and the range estimator I chose to use is what's called a kernel density estimator, and really all this is doing is drawing kind of a smooth polygon around these more densely used locations, and then we're treating that as like a seasonal range. On top of that, I was trying to define the number of different ranges that they seem to be exhibiting. Many of the birds that we marked were female. There was only a few males used in this analysis, but most of these birds exhibited these 4 pretty distinct seasonal ranges in both Utah and Nevada. The first being what I'm calling the breeding range, so that's where they're doing their mating. The hens are nesting, and they're raising their chicks for these first couple of weeks of their life. And then I'd notice they'd make this rapid movement to what I'm calling the brooding range, where she'd often finish rearing her chicks at this other site, and then now we're at the end of the summer, and she'd make this other rapid movement to what I'm calling the transition range, which was usually in the fall. She'd hang out there for a couple weeks, often in October, and make this other rapid movement, often upslope, to her winter range, and then repeat, come back down to that breeding range. I was also taking just the straight line distance between the centroids of the breeding and the winter ranges. I'm just going to jump right into the results here. I'm not going to go through all of these numbers, but we have the Utah birds on the left and the Nevada birds on the right. We were able to track 12 birds each for consecutive years. So these are range sizes in hectares. And what I'd first like you to notice is that those those Nevada ranges are considerably larger than all of the Utah seasonal ranges. That might be because the Nevada study area was considerably more arid and dry, meaning these birds are likely using up more space to meet their foraging needs. I'd also like to point out that the winter range wasn't necessarily the smallest range. Now, there are very few observational studies that tried to get at this stuff, all of which are from several decades ago. And many of them seem to conclude that the winter range would be extremely small. You know, they're in these harsh environments in the winter at the top of the mountain, and they're probably not moving around that much. But here we can see it might be the breeding range, which is really the smallest. And that could be because they're the most territorial this time of year. And now we have some GPS data sets that show that they're using more space in the winter than we may have previously thought. Now we have similar mean nesting to winter distances on the bottom row there, ranging from about 6 to 8 kilometers. But there really was a wide range in these distances. So here are our 7 dusky grouse we tracked in Utah. And so these are the cumulative distances, like their year-round travel distance in kilometers. And we can see that some of these birds, like the red one, it might just be going up and down the same slope between her nesting and winter range, all the way up to 63 kilometers, where these birds are not just going up and down the same slope, but they're going these vast distances within a year between where they like to nest and spend the winter. All right, now I'm going to get into the site fidelity stuff. And we were already noticing these strong site fidelity trends in the beginning of this. So here's a video of a female dusky grouse that we were able to track for 3+ years. And we're going to see her return to the same 4 seasonal sites here. Now she's on her winter site, and she's going to go down for her spring migration, where she's going to nest and start rearing her chicks. Then she's going to move them to that brooding range just to the north there for a month or so, and then hop up into Idaho for the fall, back down to the Beaver Ski Resort, where she actually spends the winter between the ski lanes there 3 years in a row. And she does the same pattern 3 years in a row. So we knew they were having this site fidelity trends, and I wanted to try and get at it and describe it to some degree. And there really is no go-to way to do this, but what I decided to do was analyze these like seasonal range pairs, and I'll walk you through how I did that. So you can imagine this would be a range estimate for the breeding range in year 1 of a given female. Now she's going to go and finish out the rest of her year and return the following year, and this would be her breeding range that next year. And so I took the intersecting area between those 2 ranges and divided it by the total area of both combined ranges to get this pretty conservative estimate of shared space use. So for that to be 100%, we'd have the same exact size and shape, overlaid on top of each other, which would be very unlikely, right? And so even though she's returning to what looks like nearly the same place here, this percent would probably be something only like 30 to 40%. I was also taking the distances between the center of each range pair. I did this for all the seasonal ranges, for all birds that we were able to track for multiple years in Utah and Nevada. And here are the results. So again, we have our 12 Utah and 12 Nevada birds on the left and right. And these first 2 rows are those centroid distances with the breeding and winter ranges. And these aren't huge numbers, right? Just a couple hundred meters. And these are averages. So some birds actually were approaching the single-digit meters in their centroid distances, showing that these birds are centering their seasonal ranges in very similar locations. And these bottom 4 rows are those percentages of shared space use across the seasonal ranges. And anything approaching like 40 to 50% is pretty remarkable in my opinion. We had birds approaching 80%, particularly on the winter range in some places. So they're not only centering their ranges in these same places, but they're using a lot of the same space year after year, which could mean they're using some of the same habitat features as well. All right, I'm going to move into the winter site selection. This was something I was very excited to do, to use these modern methods to get at what these birds are doing in the winter, because there was very little known about what they were doing. So we know they go upslope to these conifer stands where they persist on conifer needles. And the few observational and dietary studies that were looking into this, again, decades ago, seemed to imply that they really like Douglas fir. There were these dietary trials and these observational studies that really showed them having an affinity for Doug fir and also having an affinity for the younger needles on any given conifer species. Now, those are going to be the needles that have less toxins and resins in them. But that's really all we knew up until this point. And so I wanted to use some more modern tools that we have available to us, that being remotely sensed data. And so using satellites combined with LiDAR and fine aerial imagery and computer models, we're able to get at like the species communities of certain forest stands. We're able to use LiDAR to get tree heights, tree densities, like percent canopy cover, and then we can also try to infer the age of some of these stands, like the successional stage of these conifer stands. Then, of course, we can get elevation and slope and aspect, like which side of the mountain might they prefer. And I did this just for the Utah population, using that previous student and then my own GPS data from birds I captured. And we were downloading this data from airplanes and from the ground as well. And I used what's called the resource selection function to ask this question. And all this is really doing is using logistic regression to compare places we know the birds spent the winter. And I was using a near daily location from each bird throughout the winter. So comparing these known winter locations to where they could have gone. And it's important how you define where they could have gone, or the availability domain of this analysis. And I'll walk you through how I did that. So I first took the year-round locations of all birds used in this analysis. So this is the Bear River Range, Cache National Forest, and drew a minimum convex polygon around those farthest points. And then I chose to further buffer that out by the mean nesting to winter distance in this population, which is about 7 kilometers. And I did that to try and capture, why did they stop migrating where they did? Why didn't they go a little further? And then I wanted to take what we knew about these birds in the winter to further restrict the availability domain. So I used that remotely sensed data to isolate just the patches of known conifer within this domain. And now I'm left with this green blob here. And so these are the places I'm saying that they could have gone. And I dropped 10 random points for every 1 used winter point in this analysis, and compared the known winter locations here in blue to these random available points using logistic regression. I'm going to jump right into the results here. So these are the selection coefficients for various variables. So we have this dotted line coming up from 0. Anything on the left of that would be things they're selecting against. Anything on the right of that would be what they're selecting for. First, we have slope, which was just a binary category of north or south-facing slopes. And we see a slight avoidance of north-facing slopes, which would indicate a slight preference for south-facing slopes. A significant selection, but not a super strong one. Now I'm going to jump into the succession classes. I used 5 different categories of stand age here. And we see them selecting for the 3 oldest categories, particularly the climax succession, that being the oldest age class of these conifer stands, whereas the 2 earlier ones on the bottom are overlapping 0, indicating an insignificant selection. Lastly, for the categorical results here, I was able to use the remotely sensed data to try and tease out as many different conifer communities as I could to see broadly what are they selecting for based on those data. We had some surprising results. It's kind of hard to see. We had juniper is the top selection, closely followed by limber pine, and then this mixture of aspen and conifer, which we have quite a bit of up here in the Bear River Range, and then came Doug fir, followed by some spruce fir communities, and then we see significant avoidance of pure aspen stands, pure lodgepole pine stands, the other categories I was using, and then also maple. Here are the continuous results in this logistic regression. First being the height of the trees, remotely sensed from LiDAR. We see this tight selection for pretty tall trees, 50-foot tall trees, which is pretty tall relative to what we have available for them. And then we see a moderate, but again, tight selection for percent tree cover, around 50%. So they seem to be spending time where it's not too thick of tree cover, but not too open as well. So what does all of this mean? Well, using these more modern tools, we know they're selecting for a mixture of conifer species, perhaps except lodgepole, and more of an emphasis on limber pine than the literature may have thought previously. And then we have this weird selection for juniper, where I don't necessarily think they're using the juniper, but they also tended to be on the south slopes, which we're going to find more juniper on the south slopes here. And then Doug fir communities weren't as high as we might expect based on the little bit of work that's been done. And then an apparent use of these kind of conifer mixed with aspen areas. Are they using the aspen? I don't know, probably not, but there was no evidence of them outside of kind of like pure conifer stands before this analysis. So on top of the kinds of trees, we see a preference for these older stands, which often leads to this moderate tree canopy cover. And then we see a selection for these taller trees, and that might have to do with more access to fresh needles. So if you like those younger needles, it's easier to digest those. The taller trees are probably going to have more access for that, and you're going to have to jump around from tree to tree less if you're hanging out in tall trees. And then again, we see this preference for south-facing slopes, which is probably due to more sunlight, a thermal preference for this side of the mountain. But this was also interesting because these complex conifer communities, we don't see much of that on the south-facing slopes. That's usually what you'd think of as a north slope sort of deal. So I found that to be interesting as well. Lastly, I'm going to move into my harvest analysis. So to try to bring this full circle, I know I told you about some of these harvest monitoring techniques in the beginning, and now I want to walk you through some of the cool stuff you can do with this. So the Utah forest grouse season runs from September 1st through the end of the year. And both the ruffed and dusky grouse are managed together, meaning they have an aggregate daily bag and possession limit. And both species are overlapping in this kind of yellow polygon here in this north central vein down the state of Utah. And where I did this study here in the Cache National Forest, we have quite a bit of both. And the meat of this analysis was using these wing collection stations. Maybe you saw some of them this fall or the past couple falls. I put up 10 of these up Logan and Blacksmith Fork canyons. And I positioned them at these forest road accesses where you might be coming back towards the highway after a hunt. And you might see these signs asking for one wing from every bird that you harvested on that outing and to please put it in the bucket. I had additional signage asking for ruffed grouse only to please put the wing in an envelope and pluck some of these rump feathers off of the same bird, put that in the envelope, and then deposit that together in the bucket. And I provided envelopes. And that's because you cannot get a sex on a ruffed grouse without these important rump feathers. And you can, on just using the wing of a dusky grouse, you're able to sex it. And I checked these wing collection stations on Monday and Friday mornings to try and get at the weekend hunting pressure versus the weekday hunting pressure. Going to show you the wing totals here. Mostly want you to focus on the totals from each year. So I collected 433 wings that first year and then over doubled that the second year, despite having no more buckets, no extra effort whatsoever. And it might be tempting to think, oh, wow, there must have been a lot more birds that second year. Maybe, but a lot of this is confounded by hunter effort. And the surveys asking for hunter effort, those results aren't out yet. I'm very eager to see those results, which are coming out in a couple weeks. And so it could have just been that we had a lot more folks hunting that second year. I'm leaning towards that because I spent a lot of time working in the fall up here, and I did see a lot more folks that second year, but we can't know for sure. Here is the envelope compliance. So again, I was asking for ruffed grouse only to be in the envelopes, right? Yet I received over a third of the envelopes had dusky grouse wings in them, many ruffed grouse wings not in envelopes, which would indicate to me that some of these hunters are having a hard time telling them apart. Also, the right feather, it was only about half the time that they got those right rump feathers in the envelope. I had a lot of random feathers and feet and stuff in the envelopes. That could have been on me. I could have maybe had some better instructions for that. Here is the amount of wings throughout the hunting season, split into the different years. and then the colors are the species. I did get a few sharp-tailed grouse wings, but what I really want you to know here is that most of this pressure, or I received most of my wings during these first couple weeks of the season, those first few weeks in September. We had a few upticks as we moved into late September and into October, and these line up with the openers for the elk and the deer season, indicating that there's a lot of opportunistic harvest for these forest grouse from big game hunters while they're up on the mountain. Here's the weekend to weekday comparison results. We see about half the wings taken or collected on the weekend and the other half on the weekday. Here is a sex breakdown of both species across both years. We have a lot of gray for the ruffed grouse. That's because people weren't following the envelope instructions, so I couldn't tell you what sex it was. But I was able to sex almost all the dusky grouse wings, and we see quite a bit more females being harvested than males both years. Here is the age breakdown. That darker blue being birds that were born or hatched this year, and these other greener colors are the older age classes of birds. We see about half and half is what you would expect, except for ruffed grouse. Last year, I got more wings from these older age classes, and some of that could have been human error. The ruffed grouse wing is considerably trickier to age, but I don't think it would be to quite that degree, and this might indicate a little bit of a dip in reproduction that year. All right, lastly, and kind of the coolest thing in my opinion, is we can leverage the molt biology of these grouse to get a very rough indication of reproductive success. And how we do this is by looking at the molt limit on each wing. So these birds are going to molt their 10 outer flight feathers that we see here labeled in this very predictable pattern. Usually starting in mid to late summer, they're going to start with that P1 and then over the course of weeks work their way out to P10, where they drop and regrow these feathers. And just to prove to you that that's really what's going on, here are those molt limits across the hunting season, and we can see them progressing out towards the end of the wing, and then we have a completed molt, towards the end of the season. So this really is happening, and we can use this to infer reproductive success. I chose to do this just for dusky grouse only, and so if you look at the breeding age female dusky grouse wings collected in September only, you can imagine that a female dusky grouse that did everything right, she laid her eggs, hatched, she was able to fledge her chicks towards the end of the summer, then she's going to start molting. And so she's not going to be as far along in her molt in September when we collect these harvested wings, compared to a female that maybe it didn't go so well. She got her eggs eaten, or her chicks got depredated earlier in the summer. She doesn't have time to start over, and she's going to start molting right away. And so she's going to be further along in the molt during the harvest season here, and we were able to capture some of that. Here's a histogram of what that looked like. So these are the primary feathers in molt on the bottom. This red line kind of differentiates the successful to what we're assuming to be unsuccessful females. So females that are molting those earlier primary feathers on the left were likely successful compared to the breeding age females that were near completed in their molt on the right. It would indicate that they may not have had a successful season. And here is those estimates. And again, this is a very coarse just index of what might be going on reproductively. And if this is something you did year after year, you might really pick on some more significant trends here. But we see about a 70% nesting success using this analysis the first year, which dropped down to closer to about 50% the following year, which is similar to what I saw in the ruffed grouse age analysis. So it was interesting to see a potential dip in reproduction for both species using these different analyses that year, but then we had a lot more wings submitted that year as well. So I'm very eager to see the results of the hunter surveys coming out soon. All right, that's really what I got. I did do this little pilot study using little radio transmitters to mark dusky grouse chicks and follow them around through the summer. Ended up taking a lot of my time last year, but I don't have time to go into it right now. If you're interested in how that went, you could ask me later on about it. All right, that's what I got here. Thank you all. I'd really like to shout out to the Utah UDWR. They were the primary funders for this project. The Utah Chukar and Wildlife Foundation helped out financially as well. I got some very useful logistical support from the Forest Service. And I had these four amazing technicians where none of this would have been possible without them. This was a very field-intensive project. It required a lot of work, snowshoeing up on the mountains, handling these little grouse chicks, very early mornings, long days, strenuous stuff. So I'm very grateful to them. And then my amazing lab, Dave, my advisor, has been envisioning this project for almost a decade now, and is very passionate about this stuff. And I was very fortunate to be selected to do this study. And Dave gave me a lot of freedom in how I went about this study. And I was able to learn a lot about myself and my capabilities. And then the rest of my amazing lab for helping me out, particularly Will Herod, who spent a lot of time volunteering his time in the mid to late summer. Yeah, just volunteering for field work. I had many other volunteers and project dogs on this study that were helpful as well. I had a great time doing this research in Utah. I got to meet and work with a lot of cool people. I'd like to shout out to my wife, Lauren, over there, who uprooted her life and followed me out here and was very supportive throughout. Also, my cousin, Zach, who moved out here with me as well. All right, that's what I got. Thank you, guys. And if we have time for questions, I'll happily take a few.
Thank you, Logan. We do have a few minutes for questions. Before I get there, let me just tell you, I had some health issues right when Logan was starting. And I was I was out of commission. And so Logan really did take a ton on with that much mentoring. And I'm proud of him for that. He did an incredible job. But with that, we can have any questions.
Yeah. Yeah, Josh.
Dispersals like for young dusky grouse? I mean, they'll tend to follow, occupy the same territories as their mothers or.
Great question. So for you on Zoom, Josh is asking about that like postnatal dispersal. No, we don't know much about that. That is by far the biggest pending question I would love to answer next. That's a tricky one because to get on these GPS units on the smaller grouse and then to know with certainty who their biological mom was is a tricky thing to get at. Doing that brood marking study that I did, I was able to catch one bird where we knew who his biological mom was. We had a GPS tracker on her. I just heard from her again last week, so now this is our third summer tracking her. And we were able to put a GPS on her son when he became of age, big enough to put these GPSs on. I have yet to hear back from him to download those data to see where he spent the winter or if he's coming back to the same place that he was born and where his mom likes to hang out. So I don't know, but that's something I'd really like to figure out. Yeah, Austin.
Was there any data on time of migration? Was it the same time every year, or was it different?
Yeah, so Austin's asking about kind of the calendar dates of when they might be starting their migrations. I didn't dig into that too much, but just what I noticed was that it probably really depends on how wet it was that year. At the end of the summer and the early fall, they're eating a lot of berries. And so if we had a dry year, they're probably going to take off a little bit earlier for the fall. And then in 2023, we had that really wet year, and birds were remaining in the lower elevations for several weeks longer than they did this past year, which was considerably more dry. Yeah, Mike? Thank you.
Looked at it, but were you seeing any crossover from, I don't know how close a lot of those microphones were? And then for the future, do you think there's any way for that direction out?
Yeah, all right. Mike is asking about how far these microphones were, and maybe if we were detecting the same birds on two different microphones, and if we're able to use multiple microphones to triangulate directionality. These sites, the closest they were 500 meters, so a half a kilometer. would be the absolute closest. Any 2 points where I do believe that single note woot noise of the dusky grouse can be heard beyond that in certain cases. And so there is a chance we were detecting some of the same individuals from 2 different microphones, which is also a violation of some of these models. I did try to mitigate that to some degree. So I actually had the microphones turning on in intervals. They'd turn on for 4 minutes, and then its neighbors would be off, and then that one would turn off, and then those other ones would turn on. It doesn't necessarily really get around that issue, but I figured it might help. And then using multiple microphones to try and get directionality, that is possible, and there are some researchers that are doing that, and they haven't published it yet. Particularly some studies where they have like a grid array of microphones, and they can actually like not only get directionality, but like a position using a lot of these physics models and like the amount of milliseconds it took to hit this microphone versus the other microphone. That is out there. That's a lot more work on both the front and back end of things. It is doable, but kind of the mantra of these microphones is they are efficient and maybe a cheaper, more cost-effective tool. So to take it that far, we now might be going beyond that efficiency. Yeah, Josh.
Curious about the dusky grasses, habitat. Are you seeing them roosting in the juniper, or are they just moving day, or is it a particular period of the winter, like early or late winter, or like middle? You're gonna break that down a little bit more.
Yeah, so Josh is asking about the birds spending time in potentially juniper, which the results seem to indicate to some degree. Are they using the juniper tree specifically? No idea. So when I first saw that result, it was very surprising because some of the older literature mentions nothing about juniper and actually like an avoidance probably of it. And so I went in and looked at some of these sites that I knew to be contributing to the juniper result, thinking maybe it was a remotely sensing error, but there are truly quite a bit of juniper at these sites. A lot of my birds actually winter at the Jardine juniper like site, like literally right up there. And there are juniper trees there, but we know there's a lot of other conifer species. I really don't think they're eating juniper. These kind of more targeted, intense dietary studies did try to tease that out, and they found no evidence for eating juniper. But that's really all I can tell you. You know, I was just using a daily location, so I can't tell you what the bird was sitting in. Some of these more observational studies from decades ago, they really read more of just like descriptive results, and they do kind of follow birds from tree to tree, and saw like hardly any use in the actual juniper trees themselves. Yeah. Yeah, Mike.
Do you think the toxins, instead of additional pressure from the second year, do you think it may just be
That-
just like being in 1 year and being like,
Yeah. That could be some of it. I did start to see a lot of the same folks. They were hunting in the beginning of the season, and they'd see me up there working, and I'd sit there and talk to them. A lot of people were interested in this project. So that could be part of it, just like, because I did tell people, whenever I ran into hunters up there, I'd ask them, hey, how you doing? What'd you get? I'd appreciate it if you put a wing in my bucket, kind of thing. And so, yeah, getting the word out could have had something to do with that. And so, again, I'm really eager to see the hunting pressure results from these surveys that the state does, and those should be coming out like next month sometime.